plug it and plug it back in. No, it's still going red light. So
Okay.
what does that mean?
And so I need your request for sharing the screen as well.
Oh, you do? I made you the
Co-host?
a co-host. Yeah.
No, it's you made Doreen Harris a co-host.
Oh,
Oh, so no,
okay.
I don't know the topic that well.
Go ahead,
I'm
Doreen. It's
gonna.
up to
I've
you.
been dying to revoke you anyway. So
Okay.
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 Sorry, brother. You guys are right beside each other. That's why. Okay,
Uh,
your co-host. Here we go.
All right, there you go. All right, so sharing.
wait a minute.
Time screen, share sound. Oops. All right, so hopefully that's showing up the PowerPoints. Okay, so today we're continuing on with the historical evidence for the resurrection. This is going to be part two. And so one thing I should just say, so Reverend Sully mentioned to me in an email that he wants to revise the schedule. So last week we were operating on a 4 week agenda. So I think he's given me an extra couple weeks. So it's going to be a revised 6 week agenda. So last week we kind of looked at an introduction. What is the resurrection? Is it a physical body that we get in the end? Or is it just some spiritual, like a ghost, ethereal body or something like that? And we saw that it's a physical body that we'll be getting. Now, today we're going to be looking in week two at evaluating the historical sources. So, if you remember, when we study the evidence from a historical perspective, there are three levels. So, the first is you have to evaluate your historical sources. Then you have to glean the historical facts from those sources. And then from there, you have various hypotheses to explain the facts. Um, this week, we're starting with level one, evaluating the historical sources. Okay, so in terms of the historical sources, Christians really have a wealth of historical documents as well as archaeological discoveries, which are relevant to the question of Jesus' death and his resurrection from the dead. And so I've put this into six categories of historical sources. And just a note here. So Christians have so much historical sources and documents supporting them. I had to be very selective. So I've put a hard limit. We're only going to be using sources that date to 100 AD or earlier. Anything later than 100 AD, we're just going to ignore them because we don't have enough time to go over everything. So even with that, we still have six categories of historical source. So of course, we have the four canonical Gospels and Acts of the Apostles. We have the Pauline epistles and other New Testament writings. Then we have the third category, the pre-New Testament oral traditions. So these refer to things like creeds, hymns, and sermon summaries, which are detectable within the writings that we have in the New Testament. We also have non-canonical Christian writings, such as from the church fathers and that sort of thing. Also have early non-Christian writings. So this is the principle of enemy attestation right there. And then finally, six, we have some archaeological discoveries which are relevant. So let's kind of look into each of these categories. So starting with the four canonical Gospels and Acts. These are obviously the most detailed sources that we have, providing us with information relevant to Jesus' death and his resurrection. Now, the first question we have to assess in terms of the Gospels is how do we read the Gospels and Acts? And that comes down to the question of what's called genre. What type of text are the Gospels and is Acts of the Apostles? Now think about it. Even as Christians, we read different scriptures differently, right? We read the history of Chronicles differently from the poetry of the Psalms, or different from the Book of Revelation, which is the apocalyptic genre. So that the genre gives us clues as to how we're supposed to read something. That's why it's important. And basically, in terms of the Gospels and Acts, prior to the mid 1990s, the vast majority of Bible scholars simply assumed that the Gospels were unreliable documents. They were what they would call a sui generis, which just means they were a unique genre. Essentially, they were myths. They had embellished fictions and mythical elements. You silly Christians, there was no Jesus never died, or he was never raised from the dead. There was no empty tomb. These are all just legends and myths. And that's what the majority position was in scholarship up until the mid 1990s. Now, obviously, with such an approach is convenient for skeptics because that allows them to simply dismiss the facts of the Gospels until somebody can prove that they're correct. But this situation forever changed when, believe it or not, a skeptic named Dr. Richard Burridge, he did a study of the Gospels as a skeptic, and it was through his research that he proved the exact opposite of what he wanted to prove, that the Gospels aren't some unique genre of myth. No, these are actually ancient Greco-Roman biography. They're biographies, and in the case of Acts, it is ancient history. That's the genre of these texts. And it completely revolutionized the field to the point where the majority of Bible scholars today, even atheists and agnostics, will agree that, yes, these texts are these genres, meaning that they are fundamentally historical. And this means that, we should assume their reliability unless and until proven guilty, so to speak, in terms of when we're reading historical data in the Gospels themselves. So it's been quite a fundamental shift in scholarship. Now, in terms of the dating of the Gospels, when do the four Gospels and Acts date from? And you'll get any range of dates between 40 and 110 AD, but by far most biblical scholars will place the Gospel of Mark to about 67 to 70 AD, so about 37 to 40 years after Jesus died in 30 AD and rose. Matthew and Luke and Acts show a literary dependence on Mark. It's evident that they're reading Mark and using bits of Mark in their own Gospels. And that's why they're called the Synoptic Gospels, because they basically look the same. So these date about a decade later, somewhere around 75 to 85 AD. So again, that's 45 to 50 years after Jesus. And then finally, we have John's Gospel, which is dated to about 95 to 96 AD. So 65 to 70 years after Jesus. And you may think, well, geez, this is really late, isn't it? It's so many decades after the fact. Well, actually, this is incredibly close. This is really good evidence because for all other works in the ancient world, we literally have to wait centuries before we have writings and stuff like that. So, for example, Alexander the Great, our best sources for Alexander the Great date to between 200 and 400 years after Alexander lived, centuries after the fact. And here's just a quick clip of Gary Habermas making this point.
We sometimes hear from critics is that the Gospels are too late to be adding a lot to the life of the historical Jesus. I find this to be an incredible critique. I think largely, I mean, not uniformly, but largely, the Gospels are dated from about 65 to 70, Mark, until about 95, John, give or take. A range of about 30 years from the four Gospels. Now, if we take the cross at 30 AD, that's about plus 30 for the first Gospel, about plus 60, 65 for the last Gospel. And the problem with this sort of thing is that's a very small amount of time in ancient historiography. When we don't have much about Alexander for hundreds of years, best known biography 400 years after the fact, we could research Julius Caesar from Tacitus or Suetonius, certainly two of the better Roman historians. Tacitus may be the best, and he records this well over 100 years. Dio Cassius is sometimes used for some of these early sources. These are right till after 200 AD. So the complaining about, oh, it's too far, too far, too far, but the Gospels come in the case of Mark, at just 35 years, and all of a sudden, oh my, look how old this is. Now, the comeback is something like, yeah, but those are Roman histories, and this is religious propaganda. Interestingly, there's virtually no Greco-Roman source that does not record miracles, prophecies, portents, and most writers have said, as well as ethical conclusions, by the way, and writers have said there's not that much difference. In fact, the leading conclusion today is that the Gospels are Roman biographies. So I think we have excellent sources here from close enough for the time to make a real difference.
All right.
It's about listening to people.
All right. So you can see it. Within scholarship, these are very early sources here compared to other ancient writings. Okay, so the final question we need to evaluate with the Gospels and Acts is authorship, right? Obviously, Christians, we have the traditional authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But is there actual evidence that suggests these were, in fact, the authors? And the answer is yes. We do have surprisingly good evidence. So, for example, I'll start with the Matthew's Gospel here, go out of order. But with Matthew's Gospel, right, who was Matthew? Well, he's an eyewitness. He's one of the 12. He was a tax collector by trade. Well, it just so happens with Matthew's Gospel, scholars have identified that there's clearly, whoever wrote this Gospel had a Jewish background. He's very familiar with specific geography, specific Jewish customs that date to Jesus' time, as well as Jewish history, such as, with Herod Antipas. He uses the correct title, Tetrarch, instead of calling him King Herod Antipas. And that's not a title that someone would be able to just guess living after 70 AD if they weren't living in the land. Additionally, Matthew's Gospel frequently uses numbers. It appeals to money and stuff like that. The author basically seems to fit a tax collector's mindset, even to the point where he uses unique monetary terms, such as using the term drachma in the correct place, or talent, or stater in chapter 17, verse 25. He gets the correct monetary terms in the right places, suggesting he's familiar with money and the different types that were going around. And then finally, Matthew, he calls himself Matthew, whereas Mark and Luke don't. They call him Levi. And it's only in the Gospel of Matthew that he refers to Matthew as the tax collector, for example. So these are some internal evidence suggesting that Matthew was the original author here. In terms of Mark's Gospel, so Mark isn't one of the 12, right? He's obviously not an eyewitness, but scholars recognize that he was basing his material off of the Apostle Peter. So Peter's the primary witness behind the narratives that Mark is writing here. And, what's some of the evidence suggesting that? Okay, so I have a 5-minute video or so just kind of giving some of the internal evidence proving that Mark used Peter as his source. So let me show that. All right, here we go.
Ask this objection. Are there any internal clues in Mark's gospel that point to Peter being the source? Let's take a look. For starters, Mark mentions Peter way more than any of the other synoptic gospel writers. Mark names Peter once per every 432 words. Now, when you compare that to Matthew mentions Peter once every 654 words, and Luke every 670. It's also noteworthy that Peter is the first disciple identified in Mark right at the very beginning of his gospel. He's also the last disciple mentioned in the book right after the resurrection. So what's the big deal about this? Well, scholars like Richard Bauckham tell us that by bookending Peter, Mark uses a literary device called an inclusio. We see this device used in other ancient texts to denote an eyewitness source. Mark's use of the inclusio is a nod to the reader that Peter is the principal eyewitness of his account. There's also little grammatical clues that tip us off that Peter is the principal eyewitness in Mark. About a century ago, a biblical scholar named Cuthbert Turner published an article that argued that Mark gives us Peter's point of view. In order to demonstrate that, Turner points out that there are 21 different times that Mark uses a plural to singular form. The best way to understand this is by seeing a few examples. So in Mark 5:1 through 2, it reads, "They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit." Or Mark 8:22 that reads, "And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him." Or Mark 11:12, "On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry." Notice that each of these examples have to do with the movement of Jesus and the 12. New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham writes, "The plural to singular narrative device in Mark meets the test for internal focalization. It is possible to rewrite the passage, substituting first-person forms for the third-person references to the focalizing characters." In other words, the word "they" could have been the word "we" in the mouth of Peter, the original storyteller, sort of like the famous "we" passages that we find in the book of Acts. Also in Mark, we often see that when Peter takes a role as a named individual in a particular scene, readers get Peter's perspective on certain events. They move from not just the disciples' point of view, but from a disciple distinguished from the others. So we see not only Jesus, but also the other disciples from Peter's perspective. For one example, there's Mark 14:27 through 31, which reads, "And Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee.' Peter said to them, 'Even though they all fall away, I will not.' Jesus said to him, 'Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, 'If I must die with you, I will not deny you.' And they all said the same." And in Mark's story of the Transfiguration, Peter's inner motivation is explicitly exposed. Mark 9:5 through 6 says, "And Peter said to Jesus, 'Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified." And in the story of Peter's denial, we have a passage where the readers go with Peter into a situation removed from the other disciples. Also, we all know that Peter suffered from some serious foot and mouth disease. Peter was regularly saying something that made him look impulsive and at times just plain goofy. If Mark was Peter's spiritual son, we'd expect him to paint Peter in a much kinder light than the other gospel writers, even if he can't leave all of his flaws out. And as it turns out, that's exactly what we find. Matthew details Peter's failure when he tried to walk on water. Jesus called him a man of little faith, while Mark chooses to leave this incident out. And in Luke's gospel, we read about Peter's miraculous catch during his call. Luke paints Peter as reluctant to obey, and after the miracle, he tells Peter to depart from him, for he's a sinful man. Mark's account omits this event completely. And in Mark, Jesus talks about how it's not food that makes a man unclean, but what comes out of his mouth. Peter, being slow on the uptake, asks Jesus to elaborate. Jesus shoots back, asking, "Are you so dull?" Mark's gospel says that it was the disciples who asked Jesus for further explanation. Matthew points out the fact that it's actually Peter. And in the story of the woman with the issue of blood, Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" Mark says the disciples got a little snippy with Jesus. They said, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and you're asking us who touched me?" Luke's version tells us that it was Peter who actually asked the sarcastic question. And examples like this can be multiplied. And then finally, Peter also gives us apparently trivial details that indicate Peter's involvement with the book. Mark is the only gospel writer who tells us that Simon and his companions were the ones looking for Jesus when he was praying in a solitary place. Mark alone identifies that it was Peter who asked about the timing of the temple's destruction on behalf of the other disciples. Also, very interestingly, Mark alone tells us that Jesus came home in Capernaum. Well, Jesus wasn't born or raised there, and Matthew says that Jesus came home and settled in Capernaum in a parallel account, but he doesn't call it home. This only makes sense when we read elsewhere in Mark that Capernaum was actually Peter's hometown. It makes more sense for Peter to refer to Capernaum as home. These little incidental details put Peter's perspective in the account, and it's not as if Mark was extra motivated to put them in there on purpose. So when you put all these particulars together, there's plenty of evidence in the text itself that shows that Peter is the main source of Matthew's account. All of these facts confirm what early church fathers have told us all along. Mark's gospel is based on Peter's preaching.
Okay, so that's it for that clip. And I realize, there's a lot of information here, so I should probably be taking some breaks. And does anyone have any questions based on what we've gone over so far?
Dale, I think it would be probably a good idea to explain to them the importance, like kind of reiterate the dating of the Gospels versus other datings of other ancient sources. Because when people hear 30 to 40 years, oh, that seems like forever. But as Gary Habermas was talking about, and you're stating that that is actually in a historical sense very short. Just to reiterate a little bit more why those dates are good for us, whereas in antiquity the other writings are much further.
Yeah, so just by a comparison, it may seem on the face at face value that, oh well, these are so late, right? They're written 3 to 6 decades after Jesus' death and resurrection. But like I said, for scholars, this is incredibly valuable information because this is very early, actually. Just on the span of decades, it's not enough time for, for example, scholars have studied actual myths and how they form or develop. And it's not something that develops over just a matter of decades. It actually takes a couple centuries for myths proper to form and become solidified in the tradition or the historical record of a group of people. So there isn't actually enough time within 3 to 6 decades for myths to just fully, to start and then to become crystallized within the community. So this suggests that all of the traditions we're getting with Jesus are historical. No, they're reporting these details so early because they're true. And like I said, when it comes to other historiographies, we do our best sources all date centuries after the fact. We don't have copies of them dated within decades and that sort of stuff. So yeah, the comparison is really, it's night and day in terms of the gospel manuscripts as well as the original autographs that we have, the originals being written within those decades. Does that make sense, or are people still concerned about that? So, Suli, did that answer your question?
Oh yeah, yeah, that definitely answers my question. Because I know I have charts on stuff like this, just to show how close it is versus manuscripts, how many manuscripts we have versus other writings of antiquity of how many manuscripts they have versus the length of time that has lapsed. So we are very much in the position where our writings are very early.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So, everyone, and the point about this, the fact that the other Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, the fact that our earliest sources date so far in comparison to the Gospels, but yet no historian in the world doubts the existence of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar and that sort of thing. So that's really why we should be absolutely confident about the historicity of Jesus and the data that we're getting in the Gospels and stuff like that. If you just go by a compare and contrast approach. All right.
And also, like I would say that most of the eyewitnesses were still alive, and so that they could easily say this isn't true, but what they had seen, they with their own eyes, they agreed with, obviously, because it's written down.
Yeah, so in terms of the Gospels, I would say with the traditional dates, it's right towards the end of the apostolic age, right? So the apostles, original eyewitnesses, did start dying around the 60s AD with Nero coming into power, and the Gospels were written just immediately after that. Again, according to the majority view in biblical scholarship, there are people that date the Gospels earlier. But so we're getting second generation Christians, and as well in the case of Matthew and John, John outlived everybody. So became known as John the Elder. He made it until the 90s AD, and everybody knows that about Christianity. So he was kind of remarkable in that he had an extraordinarily long life, because he was the youngest of the disciples when he originally joined Jesus. So he was able to outlive the rest of them and stuff like that. So that's why John is an eyewitness. You're correct there.
Yeah. And just to add to this, like when we talk about the number of manuscripts that the New Testament have, we have over 8,500 manuscripts, that fragments or manuscripts in themselves. And when you talk about the distance of time, 37 to like 40-year span, if you look at Caesar and the Gallic Wars, they only have about 251 manuscripts, and the earliest writings of that are like 900 years apart.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
to show you, I just want them to see how early are you're talking 37 to say 40 years versus 900 years of these Gaelic wars, right?
Exactly. And one thing I should just clarify, because in week 6, so there is a difference between what me and Suli are talking about here. So when I'm giving these dates, I'm giving these dates for what is called the original autographs. So the Gospel of John as written by John originally, and as written by Mark and Matthew and Luke, the first copy that they wrote themselves. These are the dates for that. Then we have the question of the manuscript copies of the original writings themselves. And that's what Suli's talking about. In terms of the manuscript evidence, it is incredibly supportive of the authenticity of the Gospels. We know with certainty what the originals said. There's no doubt that 500 years later there was translation errors, and we just have no idea what John himself actually wrote. So that's textual criticism, and I'm going to get more into that in week 6 as an objection. But yeah, just wanted to clarify that. Okay, is everyone good with the authorship so far? Okay. All right. So just want to finish off on Luke and John. So in terms of Luke and authorship, I think the main thing that I'll say here is that we have various reasons. We know that Luke and Acts were written by the same person based on the literary style as well. Both books are dedicated to the same man, Theophilus. And obviously, if you're in the first century, this Theophilus, he would know who he's commissioned, Luke in this case, to write the gospel and the history for him. Secondly, Acts refers to the first treatise. So we know that there's a preceding book that precedes the book of Acts. And this is most naturally understood to be the gospel, right? So you get the life of Jesus, then you get the history of the early church immediately after Jesus ascended. As I said, there are strong similarities between the language and the style. And another thing I want to ask in terms of, well, how do we know that it is actually Luke? Well, Paul mentions his companions, Luke, and within within Acts of the Apostles, there are what are called the we passages that I have here. So it's passages where Luke is saying, hey, we, meaning me and Paul, we're traveling to Athens or traveling to, I forget the name of it, Thessalonica or something like that. So there's this assumptive we, like, hey, me and Paul, we're together, we're going here, and we're doing this. Versus, Luke doesn't do that everywhere. When he's not in a place, he doesn't use the word we to describe that because he stays behind and Paul alone goes to another location. And this just happens to independently match where we know Luke was following Paul based on the epistles and other information and stuff like that. So this is a mark of authenticity. We know that this was written by Luke, the companion of the Apostle Paul. So that's evidence there. Finally, with the Gospel of John, we know this was written definitely from a Jew who lived in Palestine. He was very familiar with first century pre-70 AD Jewish customs and geography and certain things or aspects such as burial customs. He knows that Jacob's well is deep, for example. He distinguishes between Bethany and I think that should be Bethany beyond the Jordan. So that's something you wouldn't know if you didn't live in the land. He also has intimate knowledge of what happened among the big three disciples. So John seems to have insider status, not just among the 12 disciples, but he knows what the big three, what Peter, John, and James got up to, and stuff like that, such as with the transfiguration, right? Because it was only Jesus and the big three that were present. So he has certain knowledge that he would only have if he was one of the big three. There's also a lot of independence from the synoptic traditions. So I mentioned that Matthew and Luke borrow or copy material from the Gospel of Mark in some cases. John doesn't do that. 90% of his gospel is totally unique. So it's almost like, hey, I'm John the Apostle. I was there. I've got my own stories to tell. I don't need to borrow anything from Mark or anything like that. I was there and I've got my own unique authoritative perspective. So those are some of the evidences there. And scholars have reading John, they say it displays marks of a vividness of recollection. So he's got a vivid memory as an eyewitness. So yeah, that's it for the Gospels. Any questions before I move on from that? I know it was a lot of material, but yeah, any questions at all? No.
I guess still that's a highlight for our group that each gospel writer writes about Jesus from a different perspective. So, like you're saying about Matthew's writing from a Jewish perspective, whereas Mark is writing from a Roman perspective, Luke is writing from like a Gentile perspective, and John, he's writing for new believers. And we see that in the gospel. So each author has their own unique way that they're presenting Jesus.
Exactly. They have their own unique, I didn't get into this, but they have their own unique emphases and themes that they want to stress. Like, for example, you mentioned Luke. Luke really wants to stress that, Gentiles and Jews were all one and stuff like that. That's one of his main things and stuff like that. So yeah, you're totally right. All right. And anyone else, or we're good to go?
Good to go.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. So next, things are going to get a little bit easier now. So their next category of sources are obviously the Pauline epistles and the other New Testament writings. Now, I'm going to be, for our purposes in this study, I'm going to help the skeptic out, and I'm going to ignore the other New Testament literature, and I'm just going to focus in on the Pauline epistles. Now, what's remarkable about these is that most biblical scholars, even atheists and skeptical ones, admit that the Apostle Paul was the guy who actually wrote the Pauline epistles. At least 7 out of the 13 epistles, even the most biased atheist in the world admits, yes, Paul wrote that. Paul wrote that epistle. So in other words, even the skeptics are giving us these historical sources, at least 7 out of the 13, and saying, here, you can use this. Yeah, I believe the Apostle Paul wrote this, and we can use this to gain data out of it. So what are these 7 authentic Pauline epistles? So it's Galatians, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, and 1 Thessalonians. And I just want to go ahead. I just want to clarify. Look, this is just because the skeptics, I'm not saying that there's not good evidence for all of the other epistles being written by Paul in terms of the other Pauline epistles. Of course there are. And of course we can debate the atheists and skeptics and stuff like that. But I'm just telling you that the evidence is so good for Pauline evidence with the case of these 7 that even the most biased atheists, people who, I think even Richard Carrier, he's someone who says Jesus never existed in the first place, but even he will admit Paul wrote these 7 epistles. So That's how strong the evidence is for the Pauline epistles. And here's the remarkable thing, because these were written even earlier than the Gospels. They date to around 48 to 59 or 62 AD at the latest. So this is 18 to 32 years after Jesus came. Within 2 decades, we have information from the Apostle Paul, an eyewitness who had his own appearance and was privy to the Jerusalem apostles. So that's incredible evidence. That's a great historical set of sources that we're going to be using in our study. Any questions about that before we move on? No. Okay. Okay.
I
Yep.
forget, you told me that how the apostles think the Gospels were written before the Pauline ones, and I don't remember what your answer was.
So say that again. Someone told you the Gospels were written before?
The Gospels, like you think the Gospels come first, right? So I thought that, and you have the date for the Pauline epistles from 48 to 49 AD. And I don't remember what the answer was you gave me.
So that's not what I said. So it's the opposite. So the Pauline epistles were written, those are the earliest writings that we have, dating to the late 40s AD. The Gospels come afterwards, at least according to most biblical scholars, right? The traditional majority dating. And the reason for that is because Paul's writing during his missionary journeys. So the apostles are still alive, and he's writing letters for certain occasions, right? So, there's a problem in the Corinthian church, so I need to write a letter to fix that, and give them advice, pastoral advice and stuff like that. Whereas the Gospels, they're coming in once the apostles are starting to die off in the 60s. And now there's a need to preserve in written form the oral traditions related to Jesus. And that's why they start writing Gospels at that later time, because, okay, now the eyewitnesses are starting to die off. So we have to write an account of what do the eyewitnesses say about Jesus and his life and his ministry. So does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah, actually, to add on to that, Paul's first writing, what they say is the First Thessalonians is the first thing that was written.
Yeah. That's what I believe as well. Craig Keener said that there is some debate that it might be the second earliest, and there might be one earlier. But I think the majority view is, First Thessalonians is the earliest. That dates to around 48, 49 AD. So, yeah, cool. So everybody good with the Pauline epistles?
So are we saying all the epistles should be in the order of in the New Testament? Matthew should not be first.
So no, in terms of the order of of how the order in the canon is, that I don't think that matters, right? Because the canon is arranged for theological reasons, not it's not out of chronology, right? So obviously, I think it's best to start with Jesus. He's the founder of the movement. He's God in the flesh. So he's the one that it started with. So I actually think the gospel should be first, the way it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So now here's something that you may or may not know about. I'm not sure if Suli or Tony Costa taught you guys about this, but look, we're Christians. We're not limited to just the writings. The earliest writing, as Suli was saying, First Thessalonians dating to 48 AD. But we have sources that date before that we can detect as scholars. And we can detect the actual oral traditions that predate the New Testament writings themselves. So, for example, scholars have identified various oral creeds, hymns, like songs that the early church sang in the first couple decades. In Acts of the Apostles, there are various things like sermon summaries, such as in Acts chapter 2, when Peter, on the day of Pentecost, gives his sermon. That's a sermon summary. This was an oral tradition that was memorized by the early church to help them remember the facts related to Jesus' death and crucifixion, or whatever it is, right? So there are these oral traditions detectable within the writings themselves, and these go back even way earlier than the writings themselves. Even in some cases by decades. The earliest creed we have, and it just happens to be related to the death and resurrection of Jesus, is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3-8. And this is a creed that dates, even atheists like Dr. Garrett Ludeman admit this creed dates within 3 to 6 months after Jesus rose from the dead. Even the atheists admit this. And here's what it says, right? So, for I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received. This is a rabbinical saying. This is a rabbinical idiom. This is how we identify it as a creed, because Paul's saying, look, I officially delivered to you exactly what the tradition I received. It's the rabbis would use this phrase when conveying traditions from rabbi to students and stuff like that. And then he goes on, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then, last of all, he was seen by me, also as one born out of due time. Obviously, the me is Paul there. So this is an edited note by Paul, added to the creed. But this part of the creed, this was memorized by early Christians, kind of like we say the Apostles' Creed in churches today. This was the creed that the early churches said within 3 months of Jesus' death and resurrection. And here's just a 3-minute clip of Gary Habermas talking about the importance of this. So let me bring that up. Oh, here it is.
All right. This information that Paul actually preached and then wrote in 1 Corinthians 15, that first little section there, is what scholars call a creed.
Correct.
Okay? And that creed, Paul says, I got from somebody else. And the question is, who did he get it from? He could have gotten it from Peter and James at 5 years after the cross when he met with them in Jerusalem, or that creed could have come when he actually saw the risen Jesus at +2 from the cross. All right? And scholars want to know, when did this creed, this information, what is that information, by the way, that's in 1 Corinthians 15, and then tell us about how far back the scholars are saying this goes.
Well, we used in an earlier show, we used the words pre-Pauline. Here's the cross. Paul comes to Jesus. Now, pre-Pauline could be, in this case, anything up to the writing of 1 Corinthians, but technically the real heavy pre-Pauline stuff is right in here. It is this. When Paul comes to Jesus, if he would have stopped and said, stop the presses, I'm a Christian now, what do we already know about Jesus? That creed would have been there. That creed would have been in existence. That's pre-Pauline means Christ died for our sins according to Scriptures, buried, rose again from the dead according to Scriptures, and appeared to Cephas, and then 2 individuals, 3 groups. Paul appends his name. Except for Paul appending his name, that list is there when Paul's converted.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
But I love the fact he appeared to 500 people at one time, all right?
Yeah.
And he appeared to the apostles. And two things. We want to talk about his meeting with Peter and James, but he meets with all of the apostles at 48. But sticking with this this pre-Pauline thing is this answers the question, Christianity was not invented by Paul.
Exactly, and that's so important because it was a 19th century German liberal view, which still is a...
Okay, so he's getting into something else there, but so you can see he's putting it a little bit generous at up to 32 AD. But you can see this is a pre-Pauline creed that's identifiable by scholars, and it dates within months to 2 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. This is what the earliest Christians were saying in the churches as their creed, just like we today say the Apostles' Creed in church. No, why is my thing frozen here? Am I still alive or am I frozen? Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
Up the
Well,
top.
we can hear you. You're moving. You're good.
Okay.
Maybe your screen is frozen.
It looks like my video's frozen. I can't get back to my slides. What's going on?
hangover of today.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is a crucial historical source to understand. So does anyone have any questions? Does this make sense, or comments or anything you want to say about these pre-New Testament oral traditions? Okay, all right. I will just say this blew my mind when I was doing my research as an unbeliever. This is incredible. No other religion in history has evidence comparable to this, where we can get within months to 2 years of the actual events of the religious founder. This is totally unique for Christianity. Okay, but guess what? We're not done, because we also have sources that go beyond the Bible, again, attesting to historical facts about Jesus' death and resurrection. So again, all of these are sources dating 100 AD or earlier, within 70 years of Jesus on the cross. And here we have the early church father, Clement of Rome. So he's writing around the same time as the Gospel of John in 95 AD. So about 65 years after Jesus. And he's an apostolic father in Rome, and he's writing a letter to the Corinthians. Once again, those beloved Corinthian brothers and sisters were up to no good. They needed a little bit of a chastisement there. But so Clement's writing to them and about various issues. And in it, he actually mentions the physical bodily resurrection of Christ. And he uses an analogy, the analogy of the phoenix within Greco-Roman mythology. So he's trying to use that as an analogy for what happened to Jesus. And what's also important here is he gives us historical information surrounding the apostles Peter and Paul. He tells us they were killed. They were martyred for their faith in Jesus's resurrection. So you can see Clement tells us Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors, and when he had at length suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him. And then in another, he goes on, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance after being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee and stoned, and by blah, 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 and he came to the extreme limit of the West and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. So First Clement, this is a source that dates about 30 years after Peter and Paul were killed in the 60s. So this is incredibly close evidence supporting that detail. Okay. The next one is the historical sources from non-Christians. And it just so happens we do have one non-Christian source attesting to Jesus's death and even resurrection. So it's from Josephus. This is a secular Jewish historian, has nothing to do with Christians. He doesn't like or agree with Christianity in any way. And he was writing a secular history for the Roman emperor at the time. and it was called the Antiquities of the Jews. This dates to around 93 to 96 AD. So again, it's about 60 years after Jesus, around the time of the Gospel of John. And Josephus makes 3 references that are relevant to Christianity. So the first is that he mentions the imprisonment and death of John the Baptist. In another reference, he makes reference to the death of James, the brother of Jesus, in Jerusalem around the fall of the Second Temple, around 70 AD, or just prior to that. And then finally, we have what's called the testimonium about Jesus. So his testimony specifically about Jesus. And there is controversy surrounding the passage about Jesus. The other 2 are uncontroversial. All scholars, even atheists and skeptics, accept them as authentic, right? So we know that James, the brother of Jesus, was martyred, and we know that John the Baptist was martyred, just like the Bible tells us. But this is a secular Jewish historian telling us this. But in terms of the testimony about Jesus, there is a lot of controversy here. So skeptics will say, well, Josephus didn't write that part about Jesus. Later on, a Christian wrote stuff in about Jesus. So this has been a problem. Can we trust the testimony of Josephus or not in terms of what he says about Jesus? And believe it or not, the vast majority of Josephine scholars and historians say that we can trust the testimony. The testimony is authentic. At least a truncated version of it is. So this is what we can trust as historical. And this comes from Dr. Louis Feldman. He's probably, in the entire world, he's the #1 Josephus scholar. Nobody knows more about Josephus than Louis Feldman in the entire world, I would say, at this time. And he says this is the historical bit that we get from Josephus. He removed the controversial bits. He says, quote unquote, at this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So you can see, I just want to play a quick 2-3 minute clip from Dr. Mike Licona talking about the value that we get from Josephus here. So, yep, here it is.
All right, well, so Josephus is sort of the most popular of the non-Christian sources. There are a number of other ones that we're going to run through here. But before we do that, what sort of value do you think you place on Josephus's 2 references here to Jesus? Is there much value here?
Well, for the first one, Book 20, Section 200, yeah, it tells us about Jesus was known as the Messiah by some. He was referred to as the Messiah, and that he had a brother named James who had been martyred, who had been or had been killed. And in fact, Josephus says that he was charged with being a lawbreaker, breaker of the Jewish law, which is something we find in the book of Acts they accuse the Christians of being. So it's certainly coherent with what we find in Acts and later church tradition from Clement of Alexandria and Hegesippus that James, the brother of Jesus, had been martyred. So that doesn't help us in terms of our current project. It does with the historical Jesus, to know that he had a brother who had been killed, executed, and then that Jesus was known as Messiah. But, for our thing about what happened to Jesus, the Book 20, Section 200 doesn't help us, but certainly Book 18, Section 63 does. It informs us about Jesus' death by Pontius Pilate. And he says, at the instigation of the leading men among us. He's talking about the Jewish leaders. So that's completely consistent with what we find in the Gospels. And if Josephus mentions the disciples reporting that he appeared alive to them 3 days later, that's pretty cool too. So,
okay, so I think you guys get the point here. Just going back to the slide. And One thing I just want to, oops, one is, what the, okay. One thing I just want to say about Josephus, lastly, this is independent testimony. So you might get a skeptic who would say, well, Josephus, he's just reading the Gospels or listening to what Christians are saying and reporting what Christians are saying. He doesn't actually know what he's talking about from secular history. But that's not true. Josephus is actually independent because he was a leader in Jerusalem going all the way back. He was born in around 37 AD, so 7 years after Jesus died, Josephus was born. And he was associated with the Second Temple elites of the time. He had access to the history of the Jewish leaders and stuff like that. And he would have been privy, hearing about the leaders' perspective on this Christian, from their perspective, cult going around. And he would have been in a position to know whether what he's reporting about Jesus was true or just Christian hearsay. So that's why this is independent testimony. Does that make sense? Any questions so far about either Josephus or Clement? No? Okay. Finally, we have our last category of historical sources that we're going to be using. And I think this one's the most fun. I hope so. And I hope it'll be something new for you guys. But we have various archaeological proofs related to Jesus' death and resurrection. So there are at least three categories here. So the first one is called the Nazareth Decree or the Nazareth Inscription. Just to save time, I'm not going to go over that one this week, but I will give you guys more details on that next week in lecture 3. Another one is the Shroud of Turin. We've already kind of looked at that in the previous Bible study series, right? But think about it. The Shroud of Turin is an archaeological artifact that purports to be the actual burial cloth of Christ and has miraculous images on it. So that's relevant archaeological data supporting both the death and the miraculous resurrection of Jesus. But finally, we have this last one, and this may be surprising to some of you guys as Protestants. It was to me, but the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, believe it or not, archaeological excavations have confirmed that this is actually very probably the actual site of Jesus's crucifixion and his empty tomb. And there's good evidence supporting this. So it's not just some Roman Catholic legend, believe it or not. So what is some of this? So just to kind of go over it. So Golgotha was not just some small isolated spot or hill. That's what we see in the Hollywood movies today. And that didn't exist until the 6th century AD. So 500 years after Christ, that's where we got this current notion of Golgotha, the place of the skull, as being a specific spot on a hill. No, instead, Golgotha in the Bible is called a topos. A topos means a region. It's a larger area for crucifixions and burial sites. So literally, it means place of the beheadings or execution places. And some scholars actually think that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the actual site of Jesus's empty crucifixion and then empty tomb. And what's remarkable is a couple of archaeologists, they're famous, Dr. Shimon Gibson and Joni Taylor. Now, Joan Taylor, she's remarkable because she was a skeptic. As a scholar, she said, no, there's no empty tomb. That's made up myths and legends. I wouldn't believe such foolishness. And definitely the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that's just some Roman Catholic religious site that has nothing to do with Jesus. But after her excavations, she totally changed her mind. And that's because she excavated the area surrounding the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And they proved, number one, the area was indeed used as an Iron Age quarry on a slope. There is even topsoil, which has been found built up in various areas of the pit, what they call the pit area, showing that the area was intensively farmed and there was a garden in this area. And even more incredibly, archaeologists have proven there are indeed first century tombs in this area when they excavate and under the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself. But here's the part that's pretty amazing. This is what convinces me that this is true. Essentially, originally, here's the site around the time of Constantine, so 300 years after Jesus. This X marks the spot of Jesus's crucifixion, according to the archaeologists. Z, this is the site of his empty tomb. So starting in the 2nd century, this is what the site would have looked like. So it's inside the walls of Jerusalem. You have the Cardo Maximus, that just means the heart of the city. This is the main road, the main, it's like Young Street for them. And then you have this Temple of Venus built on top of the sites. And this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre right here, the Y. So yeah, you can't tell anything where Jesus' tomb or crucifixion would be. It's all rebuilt and the city is built over it. But what they discovered through excavations is that in the 1st century, the time of Jesus, this is how the site would look. Just out the gates, this is Geneth Gate right here. We're here. So the site of Golgotha was outside the city walls, which is what it has to be, right by a couple of main roads. So that's why the site of the crucifixion is here, right by the roads. The Romans, when they crucified you, they wanted to shame you. They wanted to humiliate you. So they wanted you to be seen as a crucified criminal, as a message to others. Don't mess with the Romans. So that's why, and guess what? Yeah, that fits. But then the empty tomb was over here, and this is where they see these 1st century empty tombs. But the remarkable thing is that these walls, this area was totally redone by King Herod Agrippa I in 44 AD at the latest. So yet Christians remembered this was the site of Jesus's empty tomb and crucifixion, despite having no way to know that this was outside the city walls before 44 AD during the time of Jesus, or that there were tomb sites here or anything like this, because it was all built up and looked like this by the time later Christians came around. So it just so happens they guessed correctly that there was a site with 1st century tombs outside of the gates before 44 AD, when the renovations of the city were done and the extension of the city wall was completed. And what's more, they've proven, as I said, that there was a garden in this area. So it matches the gospel description of Jesus's empty tomb. Now, you might be a little bit skeptical here, right? Because, well, again, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that is Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic. It's not the Protestant garden tomb in Jerusalem. Well, believe it or not, there is a scholarly consensus, even among Protestant Christians today. The evidence is so compelling that even well-known evangelical and Protestants are coming around. So you have Dr. Joan Taylor, who was a skeptic, and she's a professional archaeologist and historian of Second Temple Judaism. She's a believer in this site. Dr. Katharina Galor, an Israeli archaeologist, she's come around. But even more important for you guys is Protestant scholars like Dr. Craig Evans and Dr. William Lane Craig. They both support this. They say, quote unquote, indeed, the tomb beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is in all probability the tomb in which Jesus himself was laid by Joseph of Arimathea following the crucifixion. And remember, William Lane Craig, we heard the story from Sully last week. William Lane Craig is no Catholic. He is a committed Protestant and sola scriptura Christian. And we also have Dr. Craig Keener, another evangelical Protestant scholar. And he's actually known, Gary Habermas defines Keener as a scholar's scholar. And he also believes that this is good evidence for where Jesus' empty tomb was. And I'm going to give you guys one last video clip. This is actually, you guys are getting a advance notice because I haven't posted this on my podcast yet, but I just filmed this today with Craig. So let me show you guys that clip to the 53-minute mark. Okay.
I think where I can speak more authoritatively is the Holy Sepulchre, because I think there's really strong evidence there. So how would the site have been remembered? Well, how would it not have been remembered? You know, Joseph of Arimathea, there's good evidence. I mean, who's going to make up like somebody from Arimathea? What's Arimathea? Probably Ramathaim Zophim, but I mean, who's going to, you know, so anyway, but, and actually when they were upset with the Sanhedrin, who's going to make up a nice Sanhedrist? And, you know, if he's going to, bodies did have to be buried. That was, Josephus tells us Judeans required that, but they could be buried in a pit or a common criminal's grave. They had to be kept separate so that a year later the families could come and get the bones. But Joseph wants this body. He's not asking for the other bodies. He's kind of nervous as he comes and asks Pilate because, well, I'm going into too much detail. I need to stop that. It's because I'm writing a commentary on Mark right now, so I'm really into the gospel narrative. But just cutting to the quick in terms of where the site is and how it would have been remembered. The early Christians certainly would have remembered it. The enemies of the early Christians would have certainly wanted to check it if they're going to contest with them about it. And also, when Jerusalem's destroyed, it didn't mean that everything was destroyed. I mean, we still have the archaeological evidence, and then when Hadrian was destroying places, Hadrian, that was one of the sites he desecrated because it was still being regarded as a sacred site by people. So the tradition goes back before Hadrian, but we also know it goes back well before then because everybody knew that burials had to be outside of Jerusalem. But in the years 41 to 44, King Herod Agrippa I extended the walls of Jerusalem, the third wall. The site is inside that third wall, which means that nobody would say, okay, somebody's buried here because it's inside the third wall. But at the time that Jesus was crucified, around the year 30, or some people would say 33, that was outside the walls of Jerusalem, was outside the second wall. The third wall was built, like if we date Jesus' crucifixion around the year 30, the third wall was built within 14 years of that. So the memory of that site would seem to go back to within 14 years. So earlier than Paul's letters, earlier than 1 Corinthians. And when they dug down in the time of Constantine, because of this persistent belief of people in the local area, this was the right site, they find that there are tombs in the area. Well, I don't think they knew the difference between a tomb from this century and a tomb from that century. But today, archaeologists do, and archaeologists verify that beneath the Holy Sepulchre is a first century tomb. And that area has first century tombs. And it can't be later than the first century again, because after the year 44, nobody was burying anybody there anyway.
Yeah, I think that this is fascinating to me. I think so. You're talking about, look, this has been excavated by a couple of archaeologists, Dr. Shimon Gibson, as well, Joan E. Taylor, and she makes this argument that she was a skeptic. She didn't believe in this site. Now she's a committed believer that this is true based on the archaeological evidence. And I just want to highlight that point you made about the excavations, which would have been impossible for later Christians, say in the time of Constantine or second century. They wouldn't have known about this area, which corresponds precisely to the Gospels and was obliterated in 44 AD when they did this excavation. And so one thing you missed is I understand from the archaeology they've also proven there was a garden in this area as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that so that's the little clip from that there. So yeah, this is really good evidence. Like I said, it was totally obliterated. The site was totally different from the second century onward when the Emperor Hadrian demolished the site and built the Temple of Venus to mock the Jews on this site. And they had the built up city there. Nobody would have known there were tombs underneath or anything like that. So yeah, any questions about the archaeological sources? Nope. Okay. All right. Hopefully that means I'm being crystal clear. I hope. But all right. So we're coming to the end now. So just a kind of a summary of the series so far. So last week we had sort of an introduction. We learned what is the resurrection. What is Jesus's resurrection entail? We found out that he was risen physically in a body, a physical body, not spiritually from the dead, and that Jesus serves as the first fruits for how our resurrections will be in the general resurrection. We will have a body like his, including a glorious one with perhaps extra abilities that we don't have today. Today, we went over 6 different categories of historical sources, both documents and archaeological ones that we're going to be using in our series starting next week to start to glean historical facts from these sources. So again, the 4 Gospels and Acts, the 7 authentic Pauline epistles, and I put authentic in quotes because obviously as Christians, we have good evidence for thinking the others are authentic as well. But I'm just saying, okay, let's concede to the skeptics. Even if we're conceding to the skeptics, we still have 7 Pauline epistles that everyone accepts as authentic. Thirdly, we have the pre-New Testament oral traditions. Those are absolutely fundamental. For the first letter of Clement of Rome, early church father. We have a non-Christian Jewish historian, Josephus. And finally, we have these 2 to 3 archaeological discoveries that shed light on this question. So yeah, that's it for this week. Next week, as I said, we're going to be turning to, okay, how do we glean the historical facts using these historical sources? What facts can we dig up using these sources? So that's it. Any questions, or was that too much, or? I guess so.
By the silence is probably a lot. Drinking from a fire hose.
Okay. Yeah, it is. There's a lot of info in terms of the sources, so it's hard to like cram it all into one lecture. Maybe it would have been better as 2 separate ones or something, I guess.
Well, it's good for us to see that there's more to this topic than just the biblical evidence, that there's external sources as well that we are relying upon.
Absolutely.
I learned about another creed I didn't know about.
Awesome. Oh, the first
creed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones, honestly. I have it on my wall, but that's one of the key pieces of evidence for the resurrection. There is another creed related to Jesus's deity in Philippians chapter 2. It's a hymn, and that establishes that Jesus was indeed God in the flesh. So those are my favorite 2 creeds, I would say.
Philippians chapter 2, 5 to 11.
Okay, thank you.
Is that great? Mm-hmm.
And any other questions or comments or?
I was trying to remember that creed that you said about 500 being alive, you know?
Yeah,
creed.
that's the first, that's the one
Because,
she was talking about, the 1 Corinthians 15.
15.
yeah, so they could have questioned
You know.
if they didn't believe what had happened because they were eyewitnesses.
Exactly. Yeah. This was the creed invented by the eyewitnesses. This is what they were teaching within months to 2 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. So I mean, that's incredible. Like that's way earlier than even the 20 years of Paul's epistles or the 40 to 60 years of the Gospels. We can get within months to 2 years. No other religion has evidence like that. All right.
Sorry, Pastor, what was that Philippians again? Sorry, Philippians 2?
Philippians chapter 2, starting at verses 5.
5. Okay. Thanks. Thanks.
Any cool. Any suggestions or feedback on how I could have maybe made it more understandable if it was hard to understand or?
You know, honestly, Dale, the information is what it is.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just like when we did the shroud, and
Yeah.
when the science portion probably was a lot for people to digest. It is what it is. So I
Fair
think
enough.
the information is fascinating. Maybe if you guys have something to look at after, so you could. I know our dear sister Marine likes to look over things again and again. Look at her; she's smiling. Um,
Who's that? Doreen?
No,
Marine.
no, not me. Well, I do, but
The other Reen, the other Reen.
I don't see another
Maureen,
Reen, but okay.
Maureen,
Oh,
Maureen,
there we go.
Maureen,
Yeah.
and Doreen.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I will. Did you guys get my slides from last week? Somebody was asking to.
No.
Okay, so you guys, so I'll resend.
Did you send it to me? Because if you did, I'd never seen it.
I sent you the links to the blog and
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Okay.
but I'll send you directly the PowerPoint slides for this week and last week, so you can send that directly to people as well.
Okay, I will do that. So you guys could look it over and chew on it.
So,
Okay, that's good.
Well, thank you guys for another scholarly in-depth session. You guys probably don't realize the richness of information that you're getting here.
Yeah.
And, right, this is some rich information that our brother Dale is imparting on us. So sometimes it's good to go over again. And I like it. It's very good. Very good.
Sounds good.
It's good because we don't know about all the skepticisms out there, you know, all the things people are objecting against. But so now we know.
So out of curiosity, yeah, I'll ask you guys just out of curiosity, because I know that you guys have been taught this evidence from Sully and also Tony Costa in the past. So they didn't really go over like skeptical objections and then the comebacks to it, I guess, when they.
Yeah, so Dr. Costa didn't teach it. It was I did my section on it, and we did more of the rebuttals of the arguments against the resurrection. So we did I did criteria of enemy assertion.
Okay. That's I'm coming to that next week.
Yeah,
So yeah.
We talked about the proof of you know the fact that a lot of people deny the existence of Jesus, but they won't deny the existence of Paul. And then Paul's changed, the disciples change, the apostles changes, and we debunked the theories of why the resurrection did happen versus their excuses or allegations of it not happening. But we didn't go into all this information, which is good.
Cool.
That's why I said I wanted to hear your perspective on it as well.
Sounds good. Yeah. For me, I've always split it into those three sections. Like I think you need to do the evaluation of the sources you're using. Then once you determine which sources are good to get information from, then you get into the adjudicating what are the facts. So that's what we'll do next week with the criterion of enemy attestation and all that. And then there are the hypotheses or like, how did people explain it? Was it a swoon theory? Was it a
Yeah.
legend? Yeah. So yeah, that's the plan of action.
Exciting. All right,
Awesome.
Sister Dreen, do you want to close us in prayer?
Yep. Heavenly Father, we thank you once again for this opportunity where we can come and hear your word explained to us in detail. We ask, oh God, that you will continue to open our minds and our understanding of who you are. And in the end, once what we have learned, Lord, may be indelible on our mind to know that it is authentic, that you, God, is the true God, the living God, that Jesus Christ himself did come unto this earth, died for us, rose, resurrected, and one day we will be with him. We thank you for Dale, and we continue that you will give him the ability to teach us, even though it may be complicated for us to understand at times, but in simple form, we thank you and we praise you. Bless all who have attended tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
And Dale, you can start the recording whenever you're ready.
Sorry. Oh,
You can
yeah.
start the recording.